Hello, my name is Kim Davenport, and I am the Communications Manager for Tacoma Historical Society. It's great to have you with us for our April virtual program in honor of our new exhibit, which is called Finding Home and is celebrating Tacoma's LGBTQ history. I have with me two members of an organization that has a long history in Tacoma, Diversity Alliance of Puget Sound, who are going to be talking with us today about the history of their organization and also some of the history of fights for equality for members of our community who are LGBTQ. So I'd like to first introduce and welcome Oliver Webb. Oliver, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about who you are.
Thank you, Kim. My name is Oliver Webb. My pronouns are he, him. I am the current board chair of Diversity Alliance of the Puget Sound. We were formerly Gender Alliance of the South Sound. So yeah, thank you for having us.
Great, thank you. And also with us today is Skye Locke. Skye, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about who you are.
Of course, I'm Skye Locke. My pronouns are she, her. I am the secretary of the Diversity Alliance of the Puget Sound.
Great, thank you so much for being with us, both of you. And I wanted to start with a really open-ended question, and I think this will lead to other more specific questions. But can you just start by talking a little bit about how your organization, and I know it's had some different names and some different roles throughout the years, but how the organization originally got started?
Absolutely, I think I'll take that question. Like I said, we used to be Gender Alliance of the South Sound, and actually prior to that, we started as just a trans support group. Late 90s, early 2000s, we came out of Ingersoll Gender Center in Seattle. There was a need in Tacoma, and some of those group members made it clear that there was a need, and so they asked to start a group in Tacoma. It was a social group at the time, late 90s, early 2000s, just a social group in Tacoma. And then in 2004, the founders of that group actually made it a nonprofit under Gender Alliance of the South Sound. And it continued to be a social / support group, a bit ad hoc at that time. And it continued under that name, or GAS as they called it, unfortunately, for probably about 17-ish years up until COVID hit. We had some issues losing board members. There were deaths in families. It was really hard because of online, and we had lots of board members that were either traveling or farther away or had issues with accessibility. And so it was hard on our board, just like it was hard on most of the organizations and their boards. And so at that time, I had come on under the old chair as a vice chair. And unfortunately, we also lost our chair at that time. And so I was the remaining member. And legally, we have to have a governing body. So I stepped up as chair, and we brought on Skye as our secretary. Skye was one of our members. And actually, at that time, we didn't know who our former members were. And so I had instilled a member program, and the day before or 2 days before me becoming our chair, we had just onboarded all of our new members. So our new members are who had voted me in as chair and Skye in as secretary. So we were brand new. Basically, we had added a board. And at that time, prior to that, the old chair and I, and the old board, because we had sat on a full board, luckily, but had still continued to lose people due to COVID and accessibility issues. We were still having that issue. We had talked about expanding to the entire state because it was a great time to do it. During COVID, what we learned was flexibility and accessibility. So we had added groups on Zoom. And we realized that it was a great time to expand to the entire state. We had been serving the South End in Tacoma for over 20 years, and we realized that accessibility through Zoom would allow us to serve the entire state and to expand our services. We also had discussed a name change, one, because if we were going to expand to the entire state, we would need a name change because we would no longer just be on the South End. And two, the acronym. We none of us were very proud of the acronym, and we had gotten feedback from attendees that they wanted a new acronym. So this had started under the old board that I was on, and then Skye and I put this into action. So once Skye and I came on, we started the expansion right away and worked with our new members and our attendees to work on a new name. This went through several different processes. It went through a town hall, working on new names, and that is a very long undertaking. You have to figure out names that are trademarked, names that are similar so that we're not stepping on other people's toes. Oddly enough, queer folks, we all name everything the same thing. We're all very similar names. And so we had to find new names. Then we had to go through a board vote. So we allow all of our members to vote on everything. We discuss, or we talk about how our members run this org. We are the board, but we are here to help move everything in the right direction that they've asked us to, right? So our vote is exactly the same as our members' votes. We all have one vote. And once we get a full board, we're missing a treasurer right now. I actually lose my vote. So I'm just there for a veto break or a tie break. And we've never had a tie, so I don't necessarily see it coming in the future. I'm just here as sort of the face of the org, if you will, once that happens. And I'm more than happy to do that. I believe in this org and my board and my members. So yeah, so our board and our members, we all voted. We changed our name to a Diversity Alliance of the Puget Sound, or DAPS. And we began serving the entire state, and we started branching out. So our first city that we branched out to was Seattle because it was the easiest. And then we branched out to Bremerton, and we started sponsoring a food pantry out there. And those were the 3 cities that we hit on last year. So Tacoma, Seattle, and Bremerton. And we did a lot last year. We did dual TDURs. So for those that don't know, that's Trans Day of Remembrance. In 2007, under the old org name, so Gender Alliance of the South Sound, we had founded TDUR Tacoma. And then one of our board members who we had onboarded last year, Astro Pittman, had founded TDUR Seattle in 2018. So now under the DAPS umbrella, we now run both of those TDURs. So we did technically a triple TDUR last year. So we did online, Seattle, and Tacoma. We had some flag raises in Tacoma. So the very first trans flag raise on a municipal building was raised, and it was actually half-masted, and they actually did 2. So they did City Hall and they did the PUD building. And then they also proclaimed TDUR an official day for us in Tacoma. So Tacoma has been an amazing ally for us. And then the Pacific Science Center lit their arches for us. And then without asking, they did it for TDOV this year. So we're finding a lot of allies in the cities, which is amazing and a great way for us to continue expanding.
So I'm curious, sort of a follow-up question. You talk about expanding statewide, and I wonder what that looks like in terms of both, for the organization, the challenge of covering that much geography. And I know you were traveling earlier this week, for example, but also, potentially different responses to your work in different parts of the state. So what are you finding as you try to branch out beyond sort of the Puget Sound region?
I'll let Skye talk about this as well and expand on this, but we're doing 2 big pushes this year specifically. So we've matched with PNW Eastside Pride actually on this really big project that we've been keeping a little under wraps called Pride in a Box. So we're making a playbook for all of the local governments, and we're going to survey, and the survey actually comes out in 2 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks. And we're going to survey as many major cities as we can. We've got 3 on our, or 30, not 3. We've got 30 on our side, and then Eastside Pride has maybe like 14 or 15 because they're taking the east side. And so we're going to survey these cities and we're going to ask what they want from their local government. Do they want more events? Do they want more action, like policy action? So when these trans bills come down, do they want their local government to talk to their legislature? Do they want them to do posts, right? Do they want to see stuff on social media? What do they want done other than like a flag raise? Do they need a flag raise? Are some of these cities just not raising flags? Like, what do you want to be seen? So I think we broke it down into different categories, and we're going to have Skye talk a little more about these categories and what we're doing in this committee, because we break them down into committees to do this and more of our timeline. But that's one of the big ways that we're going to go out into these cities. And I think we're going to see what it's going to look like. But we know this is going to be a stepping off point, right? So we're going to go into some of these cities and maybe they're not going to be as receptive, but it's a first step in how we deal with these cities. So when we go into some of these smaller cities, it's going to be the first time that they meet us, and maybe the first time they have really had to hear from their LGBTQ constituents. The first time that they're coming face to face with being really called on this advocacy and being held accountable. And so we understand it's going to take some time, but we want to continue that accountability. The other one is we're doing 11 prides this year. And there's a vetting process, and Skye can also talk about this because Skye's in charge of that. So we do not work with prides or events that work directly with the police. I have done a lot of volunteering, trans pride, Seattle pride, so I do understand what goes into prides. So we don't mean working with police in the way of like permits. A lot of people say like no police at pride, and that's not actually in some cases a possibility, right? So trans pride uses no police in the park. We actually have a full security team, which I also have been a part of for several years. I was on the Gender Justice League board, and so I've worked very closely with those security teams. But the police still have to stop Broadway so that we can go through. Otherwise, there's a bunch of cars. So technically, SPD is involved in some way in trans pride, but they're not in the park. They're not making it unsafe for trans people during trans pride. Those are two very different things. They're not tabling at trans pride. So Gender Justice League has not invited them in to be in their space. So with Seattle Pride, they take over all of downtown and Westlake. There's a huge map. You cannot ask them to be like, please don't have them downtown. No one's going to give Seattle Pride downtown. That's not a thing. But you can ask them not to allow them to march. You can ask them not to, you can ask Egan Orion and Pride Fest not to allow them to table. These are things that we ask, right? So when we're going to these other smaller prides, we ask them certain questions. And again, Skye can elaborate on this because we don't want to put our members or ourselves in a situation where we're maybe tabling next to their local PD, or we are having our members or our name associated with prides that are marching with PD when we take a very strong stance with the Black community, with the BIPOC community, with Black Lives Matter, where the majority of my board were in these protests, we're gassed in these protests, we're gassed on the first day of Pride. And these are not things that are acceptable to us. And we want to make a safe space for our community. And so sometimes we need to pull out of prides. And we've seen last year, we were asked to table, you know, adamantly by some prides, and we're like, hey, we can't do that. And now we're seeing this year that those prides are no longer working with police. So we're seeing a lot of changes. But this is one of the ways that we're branching out to these resource deserts, are in going to these small prides in smaller areas. But we do have some stipulations of like, how close are you with the police? So Skye, if you could talk about those two ways, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, of course. Trailing back to the survey questions that we were talking about before, we found it useful to think about different domains of questions that we would ask the people in the community about, like, do you feel safe in your community? Have you ever felt unsafe? Do you feel safe calling the police? And like, we'll broach that topic again a little bit in a minute. And then there's like events and engagement, things like, are there events that, the community or like the local government like works with the community to put on or to put together, Pride in the Park, or, some kind of events like maybe an exhibit at the local library or an exhibit at the historical society in their city, things like that. Questions about like, or another domain, for example, like advocacy. Like, what are you doing to like ensure that our community feels like safe, not as in like personal public safety, but like safe to continue existing in our community? Like when as Oliver mentioned, like a bill that comes down that might affect people in the LGBTQIA community differently than people in like the general public at large, are our local governments already thinking about this is going to affect people differently and this is going to cause a problem? Like, this is going to be an issue. So things like that. It's just like simple questions that can lead to like more specific, more detailed questions that we would need to compile the results and send them to these different communities. And as you can imagine, like, we are reaching out to the whole state at some point. Oliver mentioned we have 30 cities on our plate right now. We're reaching out to the whole state. We serve the whole state. We'll be reaching out to the whole state at some point in the future with questions similar to these. But the differences are, is Tacoma going to respond to a survey the same way that Moses Lake responds to a survey? Is the community in Moses Lake more worried about rainbow sidewalks and flag races, or are they worried about, what's going to happen if I get assaulted in the street? Do I feel safe calling the police to come and just like traumatize me further? Like, who's going to be more uncomfortable in that situation? So each city is going to be a different specific challenge, and the reaction from the community at large, or even like our community and how they respond to these surveys, is going to tell us a lot about, like, not just what's going on in their local areas, in their local communities, if there even is a local community. We do in-person groups, as Oliver mentioned, at least twice a week. And sometimes we meet people who haven't seen another member of their community all week and look forward to coming back so that they can be around their community again. And it strikes me as like a little bit differently, because 99% of my time is spent around like fellow queer people and dogs. Like, that is my current like environment. So we look forward to learning a lot about the information that we can glean from these surveys, and like the approaches that we intend to have with our rural communities as opposed to like Seattle. So we're going to have a different conversation with all of these people, and they're going to be very different on the east side of the mountains as opposed to the west side of the mountains, as opposed to the Kitsap Peninsula, as opposed to the Olympic Peninsula. All of these areas are going to be different. They're all going to have different cultures and climates and like ideals. And then circling back to like vetting of prides, we had to ask them, as Oliver mentioned, are the police going to be there in more than a what is minimally required capacity? Are they going to be like sitting at tables and like telling us about their organization or their you know, what the work that they do, like or are they going to be, is there going to be a contingent marching in the parade? You know, as he mentioned, like this is our space, and like why are we turning over part of our space to an institutional organization with which we have been at odds at times? So it's like we have that history of contention that we don't necessarily want to invite that environment into our space, because we would then feel again less safe. We actually had a conversation with our partner in the surveys that we were talking about just last night, and when they are talking to cities in their area about like police presences at Pride, they're getting surprising responses from the people in these areas. Like it's almost like they're learning for the first time maybe that, you know, perhaps other people in the LGBTQIA community don't feel as safe around the police as people in, say, the general public do. And also, like, this is a big umbrella. When we're talking about Pride, we're not just talking about like trans people. We're not just talking about the gender diverse community. We're talking about, you know, affluent white gay men who are cis, as opposed to, you know, or, you know, affluent white lesbian women who maybe don't have the type of institutional relationship with the police as people in under the rest of the umbrella have. Some people respond differently to like diversity in sexuality than they respond to diversity in like gender identity. And though like those things can play different roles with different facets of society. And so we learn that a lot of these prides are run by people who maybe hadn't thought of that. They hadn't thought that, you know, the trans community hasn't had the most friendly relationship with the police either in recent history. And the people who are running these prides, even in conversations that I have had in vetting prides, have turned the conversations around. Like at first, when I was talking to the organizer for one pride, he was very proud of the relationship that they had cultivated with the police in that area, until I mentioned, you know, the history of like the different communities under the queer umbrella that they have had with the police, and how, you know, people in the community, we're not a monolith. We don't all think of things in the same way. Just like, again, we're not going to get the same response from Carnation as we get from, you know, Bothell or Bellingham. So we're not a monolith. We're not going to have the same responses to the same question. We're not going to have the same ideas on what it means to have a police presence at Pride. We are sensitive to like different local requirements, like you know, maybe to get the permit they have to have a certain number of people on hand, but you know, they don't have to be interspersed throughout the crowd. They don't have to be you know, obvious. They don't have to, you know, they don't have to be marching in any parades or handing out pamphlets at tables. You know, they don't have to stand obviously in front of certain like vendors or locations and like make them feel like less safe, and like that, like they can or like impact the number of people who are going to come to their tent, for example. So just based on the conversations that we're having with people, we are not only learning that the rest of our community under the LGBTQIA umbrella still has different ideas from like us, say, in like the gender diverse umbrella. But we're also learning that they are open to new ideas, that they are open to stepping out of the not that good category to let's try to do something that's actually good. Let's try to do something that's like maybe better than we've been doing before. And the conversations that we've been having thus far have actually been very positive and have given me a lot of cause for optimism. But I think those are that's all the feedback I have on those topics.
Great, thank you so much. It's fascinating to hear about the work you're doing in not taking an existing program and just moving it to other parts of the state, but really trying to start conversations and share experience and share knowledge. And you mentioned several times the word history, and of course that's the perspective that our organization is bringing to this conversation, which is celebrating and sharing the history of this particular community within Tacoma. Can you both talk in whatever way you'd like to? Really, I think there's a lot to talk about here, but about what are some of the issues that the LGBTQ community has faced historically, as opposed to the issues that are being faced today. But going back a few decades or further, if you'd like, what are some of those issues? What do you think it's important for people to understand if they're looking back at that history?
Of course. Unfortunately, I don't think that they are very different. I think that we are still facing similar issues, one of which is police brutality. I think that that's what a lot of us think of, right? We think of Stonewall, however, it went back farther. Compton's Cafe is prior to that, but often forgotten. There were lots of sit-ins, which elicited responses by police that ended in police brutality. If we look at Stonewall, this ended up in, the gay rights movement, which, if we look at our history, there was a lot of erasure of trans rights, of bi rights, of more than half of the LGBTQIA, acronym, right? So Skye talked about it. Affluent cis gay men were at the beginning of our rights, and they erased lesbians, and then lesbians came forth and were like, we're not going to be erased, and then lesbians erased bi and trans people. And so we have so much erasure in our history. And that unfortunately didn't stop. We still have so much erasure. So many of our orgs, I talk about it a lot. If you listen to any of these things that I've done, any panels or come to any of our meetings, our history is just steeped in erasure. In Black trans women, they are disproportionately murdered if you look at our murders over and over. It is just the majority are Black trans women. They're not in leadership roles. Trans masc individuals aren't in leadership roles. It is non-binary individuals aren't in leadership roles in our orgs. And it's just this last few years that we're finding this push that we're just not going to be erased anymore. Our org specifically, we didn't have any of us in leadership roles either. The last two chairs, myself and the last chair, were trans masc individuals. Prior to that, it was all white trans women. And that is what all of the trans orgs were ran by and founded by, were white trans women. And that's what you're going to find across the country. And so our history in these orgs, we had so much erasure. And that's what we find in the bigger LGBTQI community, is so much erasure, so much oppression against us, and not just trans people, but against each other, right? This infighting, which is honestly what society wants. In any minority group, they want us to infight, so we break each other down. And so a lot of that is happening while we have these other things, right? We have these trans sports bills. There's a lot of attacking of trans kids right now. And a lot of that is because they're children, right? If you attack children, they can't protect themselves. We have to protect them as adults. And there's so much about like the science and the medicine, and it's very refutable. It's science and medicine, but it's being attacked by people who don't believe in science and medicine. It sort of goes to the COVID theory, right? Like, so it's a virus, and I don't want to go too much into this, but like it's science and medicine. So here's the science and the medicine. But it's very easy for someone who doesn't believe in science and medicine to be like, masks don't work. You made up masks for COVID. And you're like, have you ever been to a doctor? People don't operate on you without a mask, but they're like, no, they made up masks. And so it's very easy for me to say anything to you, right? Like I can be like, this is not a Zoom call. This is not real. Technology isn't real. And you can be like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not real. Like what you're saying isn't real. But I can say whatever I want to you. And that's a lot of what happens to us. We're gaslit as a community. And the BIPOC community is gaslit as their minority, and the Jewish community is gaslit. They literally just say the Holocaust didn't exist. And there's no refuting that if you're just fighting someone who has just made something up. And that's what we've gone through our entire existence. So we're always just fighting something that is irrefutable in the way that you're just fighting someone who's just like a brick wall. You can't fight something with facts because we all have the facts on our side and they do not care. The facts are never going to win against something that is like just ridiculous in the way of like, those are not things that make sense to us. Like if we have common sense and they do not, like that's not going to work ever. And they're taking we're using emotional labor. Like I have no problem educating my community. I, however, have a problem educating ignorant people. I am not going to use my energy to argue with someone who is going to gaslight me, who is only out for blood, who only their job in life is to hurt me, right? But like someone who needs help, someone who needs resources all day, as much emotional energy as possible, right? Like that is fine. But like these people, these things that we're fighting against, that we've always been fighting against, it's just gaslighting. So fighting against our kids to say that, you know, they can't be in sports or adults, these are just, it'll be a new thing every day. So I looked at these bills, right? So in 2018, for instance, they had 41 anti-trans bills. In the first 3 months of this year, we had 238. And they are just doing awful things to children, and they can do it to us as well. And again, it's just these gaslighting things. And of course, you know, their science isn't there, their medicine isn't there, but they're going to continue to harm us. But I don't think it's anything new. I think we're fighting the same things we've always been fighting, and it just continues to go around in a circle. And the way we pivot to fight this is we have to be adaptive and flexible as organizations. So there's only a handful of us in Washington State that solely are ran by trans individuals and serve trans individuals. I wrote them all down and I found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 of us that I can think of and that I looked up. And of those 7, one's brand new and is not actually doing anything yet. One is solely social and isn't quite trans, falls under like cross-dressing still, but like more social. One was a queer org and completely pivoted to be a trans org and a POC trans org because it was completely needed, right? So that is a perfect example. Lavender Rights Project completely pivoted because Black trans women are disproportionately murdered and attacked by these bills, by people in general, and these hate crimes are astronomical. So we had a queer legal org that pivoted to change how they serve the community. And so now they have housing and legal services, and they were just in Seattle, and now they're in Tacoma and Seattle. So we had an org that had to completely pivot to change how they serve the community, which is amazing. And that is how our orgs have to change. We completely pivoted in the way we served not only just Tacoma, we now serve the entire state. And we went from 2 groups, probably 2 to 4 groups a month, to I think we looked at like 60 maybe a year, which is very conservative, like in the other way, like thinking like maybe inflated a bit, to 233 groups last year under our last board. So the original one was doing maybe 60, and we went to 233, and we're definitely going to break that this year. And then we have Ingersoll, which had served for many, many decades, that is basically being phased out. Gender Justice League, which does advocacy and also changes, that now has a safe house and changed a bunch of things as well to serve the community. We have another one that unfortunately is basically phased out. So like we're losing these orgs because of COVID, and because of other decisions within these orgs. We are losing Seattle counseling services because of COVID and because of financial barriers, which didn't just serve trans individuals, but was a major counseling center. So we have these issues where like you have to either adapt and change how you serve the community, or you lose these major services, unfortunately. And when we lose these major services like Seattle Counseling Services or orgs that unfortunately make decisions that are not okay for the community, the rest of us have to pick up the slack and adapt and make those changes. We either have to add a bunch of groups, we have to add, services in order to be able to better serve the community, right? So yeah, but I think that we have to change in general how we serve, how we have to better ourselves, we have to better the community, and you always have to be in that service mind, right? So like I said earlier with the erasure, the big one was making sure that we change our service of the community, right? So like we had always been white trans women. We, the majority of our board is non-binary, trying to always add people of color into our board, into the people we serve, and coming from like an erasure org, an org that had issues with having BIPOC people within it, always figuring out how we can make those changes, and being actively anti-racist, being actively anti-ableist, being anti-fat phobic, like all of these things. You always need to be aware of these behaviors, because otherwise you're going to fall into old habits. Whether they were our habits or habits of that board, you bring that with you. And so you need to make those changes.
Oliver, of course, talked about the different factions or the different communities under the broader LGBTQIA umbrella. Like each letter trying to like set itself ahead of the rest in the acronym. The L, like big G TQIA, or like the big L little g, and then through the rest. Like each group like sort of setting itself and not in a malicious way. I don't think that, I don't think the gay men in our community or throughout the queer rights movement in general, I don't think it was their aim to like minimalize and marginalize the lesbian community or the bisexual community or the trans community or like any of the other of the rest of the alphabet. Like I don't think anybody was intentionally trying to like minimize and marginalize the rest of the community. I think we were seeking, like, I think as a community, we were all seeking space, like a safe space to just exist as ourselves, to exist with authenticity in a way that we could find community with other people, as well as, you know, create a safe space where we could all coexist together. And again, like, we're not a monolith. I'm sure the community has had its share of challenges with, like, you know, infighting, like Oliver was talking about, because, like, we have to make sure as we create our safe space that we appraise it to make sure that it is safe and welcoming for others under our umbrella. And like each like the larger LGBTQIA umbrella, like there's the gender diverse and the trans umbrella. Like there are different factions or sets of community inside the community. And if we are seeking to serve everyone under our umbrella, we have to make sure that we're not excluding anyone. And like, those are lessons that we've had to learn over time. You know, as Oliver talked about, our community has historically erased and minimalized the transmasculine part of our community, and the non-binary part of our community. And so we have to appraise our space to make sure that it is safe and welcoming to trans and gender diverse people of color, and to make sure that it's safe and welcoming to trans and gender diverse people who are living with disabilities. Like we have to make sure that when we create our safe space, that it is safe for everybody. Like we want to make sure that we're not being like fat phobic. We want to have like a body positivity facet to our organization that is consistent, right? We're not going to like police. I say police. We're not going to like point out the problematic discussion about, like, you know, body positivity in one space and then turn around and make a fat phobic joke behind closed doors. We want to make sure that we're completely consistent. We want to make sure that we have, you know, that we hold space for like everybody that we serve. And another thing Oliver spoke about was like how we have to like continually fight for our rights. That the ones that we have are great, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't want to transition in any other decade that I've lived in throughout my life. Like this is the one for me. But it's a struggle sometimes to overcome, like, not just belief, but belief plus conviction. Like you said, we have facts on our side. I can talk about, like, people have tried to talk to me about you know, chromosomes and biology, and I'm always able to shut them down in my mind. But at the end of the day, I feel like I've hit them with every relevant fact under the sun, and they've walked away just like made of Teflon and titanium, like nothing sticks, nothing gets through. In doing the work that we do, we find it's very holistic. Like everything is connected. Like these trans bills that are coming down, that are like affecting like our community and our children, that we as adults have to step up and say, hey, this is not cool. It's important to do the work to serve the community that we serve, right? Like I'm going to turn my back on someone that's trying to talk to me about my chromosomes and serve a member in our community that's having like a real issue that I can actually deal with. It's like, it is true that, you know, we have to like we have to break through in a way. Like we have to like make progress with people who aren't in our community, like to make sure that not only do we like look forward to a day when we can have like actual rights, but we don't like lose anything that we already got, right? It's very holistic. We are fighting to say, like, pull people out of it, like pull drowning people out of a river, while we're also moving upstream to find out why are people falling in the river. And it helps that when a community at large is able to act as an ally in that endeavor, like we talked a little bit about having conversations with like different localities and municipalities throughout the state. We just got a sub bill passed, SB 1961, regarding name changes, and it was a huge deal. We actually, the passage of this bill is actually causing us to roll up the banner on one of our programs because it will no longer be needed. And that's the kind of work that we do. That is a good thing. Like, I spoke on this panel. I spoke to this committee of state senators, and at the end of the day, I don't know if anything that I had to say made any difference, but we had other people from within the system speaking about it that might have been like more of a catalyst for change than I was. But I feel like being part of that conversation probably helped. Like, for example, if you're getting like a name change in a courtroom, you could have the court fees waived, but there's still like 2/3 of that left, which is like the recorder's fee and the auditor's fee. It wasn't clear if those fees could be waived by waiving the courthouse fees. And so, there was a big discussion, like a lot of confusion about whether or not this can actually be waived. But this bill clears up that confusion and says, yes, if you qualify to have your court fees waived, you should also qualify to have the rest of those fees waived as well. So the auditors who work with this program, or who like process this paperwork, they told the committee how it affected their jobs to not be able to waive those fees, or to not know if they were able to waive those fees. And like the rest of us were able to speak to the committee and say, we're a nonprofit organization. We don't have unlimited money. We can't just throw like name change money at the state until like everybody in our community has a name that reflects their actual identity. So like it helped to have these relationships with people, to have like those communications, and to have like a connection with people inside that system that were able to say, like, this is also problematic, and like, here's how it affects my job as well. So it was actually like a very interesting reflection on how it was to work with like in the Name Aid program that I was the facilitator of it, to be able to reach out and speak to the clerks in like each different county, because they're all different, to have that relationship with like Grace Harbor and like Pierce County and like King County, Snohomish County. I've spoken to people in all of those different counties, like where we've had applicants, to make sure that we're able to like get this name change paid for. So it's very reassuring to see progress, like positive progress in the right direction being made when it comes to safeguarding the rights that we've already gained, without like, hopefully without losing anything in the future as well.
Thank you. It's really powerful to hear you speak to that. I think, we've had a few exhibits in our museums past about fights for equal rights for various populations within our community. And there's always that theme of it's not a straight line. It's not a direct process necessarily. There's going back and forth, and it requires a lot of courage on the part of the people fighting for those rights. So Oliver, let me come back to you, and you wanted to kind of come back to that same question again and share some new thoughts.
Yeah, so I wanted to say that another issue with it is that historically, we've also had issues with our orgs in general, not erasure-wise, at least purposefully, because Skye touched on that with like our it was likely not done on purpose, other than like we have had issues in the past where everything has to be single issue. Because if we're trying to come to the table with several things, we want gay rights, we want trans rights, we want BIPOC rights. We often don't get listened to because they want one single issue. And we see this in bills, right? The only way you can get something is if you slip it in, right? And they find it or things like that. They want single issues. We have single issue voters, things like this. They really want everything to be very wrapped in packages, which I think is why we get things like, they're like, well, we can have gay rights today, and then we'll talk about trans rights later. We'll talk about Black rights later. And that's how we got women's voting rights, right? That's why it started with white women, and they had kicked out Black women because they wanted to deal with that later. They thought that they could get white women voting rights first. This is how all of this came down. So we've seen, when I talked about we have trans orgs, we have LGBTQIA plus orgs. They've been there for many, many years. But what we saw is that they were ran by LGB individuals or LGBTQ individuals, and the T was not there. Or they were ran by LG individuals, which it's great in the way that these centers existed or these orgs existed, but the problem is, for the same reason that while we serve the whole community, because these are sexual orientations, and they all exist, we don't speak on, the BIPOC community. As many of us are white or white presenting, we do have BIPOC individuals, but I'm not going to go out there and be like, I know what BIPOC individuals need. I don't know what BIPOC individuals need. We do serve the whole community, but Lavender Rights is probably going to be a better option for someone. I'm going to send them there if they have specific questions, or I'm going to send them to a board member who might be better to speak on that. So it's hard for these communities or these organizations that were speaking for the trans community for many, many years. And I'm talking about like a couple years ago, we had major orgs, including in our state, that had no trans representation at all. I was maybe the first volunteer who happened to be trans and was a major, volunteer. They maybe just got their first trans board member. And these are huge organizations. And these are things that, like, it is 2023. Like, we cannot be having these things happen still in these years. And so these are things that we're still combating. And like, that is erasure, whether we want to, it's, intent or motive behind it. Like, they don't do it on purpose. It's intent versus impact. We talked about representation earlier. These are important things. So these are still happening in big cities like Tacoma and Seattle. There are only a couple of us in Tacoma. You have an exhibit going on. If you look at those years, how many of us were at the beginning in the 50s? How many of us are left in these 2000s that are trans orgs? How many of us are in the beginning in the 50s that are trans orgs? There are not a lot of us on those bookends, right? And it's important to see that. Like, we need to be visible, because there's some trans kid that's looking at 238 bills and constantly in the news looking at some kid that can't play, basketball or kickball or t-ball or somewhere in, Kentucky or some state, right? Like, they're looking at Arkansas, they're looking at Florida, they're looking at it getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we have those bills too. They just don't ever make it anywhere because we're Washington. But we're getting a lot of red representation around here. Seattle turned red. Like, it's getting pretty scary, with these things. And we have some trans kid that doesn't have representation in the orgs in their city. And it's important that we continue to push for this. It's important that you push for your city to have trans representation, either in their both in their orgs, in their policies, in their political representation, in your work. Because it's really hard to come out when you have that. We end up with a lot of stealth kids, which it's totally fine to be stealth, totally fine not to come out, but we want to allow for that safety. And where that starts are like these orgs. It starts with representation. And we're not seeing a lot of that in leadership still. We're not seeing a lot of that. What we're seeing is a lot of news where we're being just beat down. And we're not seeing it in movies, we're not seeing it on television. And that's really the problem that's happening still. And again, I'm not seeing a lot of changes, unfortunately. So yeah.
Thank you. And I had a question that I was forming in my mind, and then I decided that I don't want to ask it based on something you said earlier. I was going to ask, I'll say it, but I'm not actually going to ask you to answer it. I was going to ask, you know, with all of the important work that you are doing within your own organization and your own community, the question was going to be, what are some ways in which allies can inform themselves better about these issues and can be more supportive? And then of course I realized that's not your job. You have plenty on your plate. It's not your job to talk to us allies about that. I would really stress that an invitation to come see our exhibit is one place to start, is one way in which people can inform themselves more about not just what's going on right now in the news, but what has happened in our very own community right here in Tacoma for this particular part of our community over the last several decades. I think it's a great place to start, because if we know that if people don't have personal experience with an issue, it can be easy for them to look past it and not have an understanding of it. And as you mentioned, it is not your job to educate about that necessarily. We all have that opportunity to educate ourselves about these things. What I will ask you, the question I do have, kind of as a final question for both of you is there anything about your work that you haven't yet had a chance to talk about that you'd like to share with our audience? Anything about the work you're doing now, anything about the history of your organization?
Well, first, obviously they can also learn about all of our orgs at the exhibit as well, and they can meet all of us at Prides, and they can donate through our websites and all of that. And I think that's a great way to support all of us, and especially during everything that's going on with these bills. And I think that it's important, even if these bills aren't happening in your state, like learn about these bills, because it's, you know, they could be happening in our states, and you need to be supporting trans kids and trans adults. Like, makes me cry. Because you know someone who's trans, whether you think you know someone or not, you know someone who's trans. You have met someone, there is someone in your life, and you know, and watch what you're saying. That's one of the biggest things as an ally. Like, watch what you're saying, because someone is listening to you. Someone's listening to you saying something crappy about some poor trans kid or some bill, and like, or some queer kid. Like, watch what jokes you're making, and whether they're about trans people or whatever else. Like, be careful what you're saying, because you are a role model for someone. This is not okay. But yeah. As for our org, I mean, I think that sorry, the trans kids got me. I think that it's, our org is, you know, not much different than the rest of them. I think that we're all just pushing to make safe spaces and claim space for those of us that are fighting to exist. We are not interested in breadcrumbs, and I think that that's what we've been getting for a very, very long time. We've been placated by the government and society, and our job is to make safe space for our community, and we do that through groups, which we run 5 days a week. We are about to go into 6 days a week for the next 5 months. June, we do not have one day off in all of June. So we've started to gear more towards engagement. We do community surveys twice a year. We also audit the entire org twice a year and make changes as necessary. So we're doing a lot of engagement. So we're doing like big events and activities. We're doing brunch once a month and a big activity. So we're going to like the fair this month, and then prides. So we make safe spaces for those who need it and want it. And we talk about how we meet people where they are, and we truly want to like actually do that. I think you hear that a lot, right? But like we truly want to live that motto. Trans people are more than HRT and surgery. You are valid if you never take medication or have surgery. You are trans the moment you say you're trans. Whether you ever do anything else other than just say you're trans, you are trans. And so we have developed an organization that honors that, that celebrates that, that gives you friends and community and activities that aren't just this like education or support groups that are just constantly reminding you of the hell we go through being trans. We have movie nights and game nights and mindfulness. Skye teaches a mindfulness twice a week or twice on Wednesdays. I do teach a Trans 201 that's a year and a half old. It started as Trans 101, and it's not a fishbowl for cis people to learn about us. It is for trans people to learn about the world around them. So we learn about reimagining policing, about coping skills, about discrimination in healthcare. And there's an overall theme for the org for that month. And then we tie in as many groups as possible. And then on Thursdays, which is when Trans 201 is, so tonight, each week has a different topic. So this month is advocacy. And so tonight we're talking about how to advocate for yourself and others against government abuses. And so we're talking about that. And then on Fridays, every other Friday, we have a group called Transmission, where we have people come in from the public that either are experts in their field or just want to talk about like what they do in their org or their business. And so sometimes they pitch hit off of what I talk about. And sometimes they just talk about their org. So we've had like Queer Scouts come in. We've had Positive Pole Spin, which is a pole dancing studio that's super queer inclusive and body positive. And then we've had people come in and talk about coping skills the next day after me. We've had a nurse come in and talk about harm reduction or discrimination in healthcare. We've also had people come in and talk about harm reduction the day after I did. So we cover all sorts of things. We've talked about coming out at work, traveling while trans. So we want to legitimately celebrate the whole person and work on the whole life, because your whole life is a transition. This is never going to end. And there's a lot we have to cover, right? So we do a lot. It's a lot of work. We're a working board. We don't get paid. There are 7 of us, I think. There are a lot of us now. But everyone has jobs for the most part. I'm disabled, so I do not, this is my job. But we have a nurse and we have social workers and we have all sorts of people on this board, and they all give a lot of time and energy to this board, and we're working to try and make safe spaces and help people claim their space, and yeah. So we encourage people to join us if they feel that's where they'd like to be.
Wonderful, thank you. It's an enormous amount of work you're doing. Skye, I'll give you the last word on that kind of open-ended question. Anything else you'd like to share that you feel like you haven't had the chance to say yet?
As with most times, I'm on a Zoom call with people. I feel like I've said quite a bit. And Oliver can like back me up on that one. I'll go off on a TED talk if you let me. He mentioned, and I think I mentioned, the people in our community who spend the vast majority of their time around not the trans community or not the gender diverse community. You know, they're steeped in a very cis-normative, heteronormative world when they're not, you know, side by side with us. So like it's important to like remember that we're not just you know, Zoom meetings on like Thursdays or Fridays. You know, we're out here like literally every day of the week, excluding the weekend, except for poor June. We it always strikes me, again, as I mentioned earlier, that like I spend the vast majority of my time around like other trans people. Like Oliver and I speak all the time. We hang out sometimes. You know, we go shopping for events together. You know, we spend a good amount of time, like twice a week. We're doing in-person groups and things, and like that's to me, like that's the important work. I am our go-to for like our trans and gender diverse veterans. I still run. We're still in the process of rolling up the banner on it, but I still run the Name Aid program. I'm still you know, I still have all of these other things. You know, I'm vetting prides. You know, I have all of these different hats that I wear. But to me, like the most important part of my week, and here I go, you got me started with the trans kids, and they're like little cutting onions. Like the most important part of my week is to be able to like sit down and have a discussion and have social time with people who look forward to that time, who spend the rest of their week looking forward to like coming and sitting down with us and, you know, having conversations about their week, and like the sometimes like the difficult conversations that they have coming out at work, coming out to their parents. You know, sometimes they don't always accept us. You know, a lot of us haven't heard from our parents in years. And it's hard when you're not like being supported by someone most of the time. And you know, when people come in and like it's their one time of the week to be like to feel community and to feel supported, like that's when I feel it's important to actually show up and to like and to like give them the experience of just being safe and being respected and being valued and to feel valid. Like I think those are the four things that like I want to bring with me when we do like in-person events, when we do like our hybrid groups in Tacoma. Like we're at the Rainbow Center from 7 to 9 every single Friday, whether it's a social group or whether it's transmission. And after that, we're not done. We go and have like dinner or something, and like we hang out until it's ready to go home, like till everybody leaves. You know, even in Zoom groups, you know, Oliver and I are typically some of the last people to like drop off the call. So we're there as long as people need us. You know, we'll hang out in the parking lot and talk to people till 12 o'clock in the morning, even though we still have to drive back to the east side. So it's like it's important to highlight like the social aspect of what we do, as I feel like that is like that is the core most important part of like who we are, not just as an organization but as human beings. And like I feel like our org hopefully reflects that value to our community as well.
Thank you so much. And it just brings home to me, you know, all the different, I get a chance each month during the pandemic. I've been each month talking to different people and sharing virtual programs on different topics and different members of our community. But it just always brings home to me that these are human stories. You are doing human work. You are serving our community in that way. And I really encourage people to come in and see this current exhibit that we have up. We're very proud of it. And as we were talking about earlier, I very much hope that we can do a few other things together with you this year, perhaps even in person, as we're starting to transition back to in-person events. So welcoming you into our space to share more about the work that you do. Thank you both so much for your time today. And I very much look forward to sharing this with our audience. Thank you.
Thank you.